Shows up. These people are crazy. I'm telling you, they're crazy.
The Democrats have lost millions of people. They've gone crazy. Honestly, I think they're crazy. What's happened to them, I don't know. They suffer major Trump.
This is big. Today, the White House asked Congress to give them $200 billion in additional funding for the war in Iran. Yeah, $200 billion. President Trump heard and was like, Iran must be getting one hell of a ballroom. That's ballroom money.
You know things have gotten serious when a late-night joke does not just go viral, it stays in the conversation. Jimmy Fallon ran a segment that had audiences cracking up at Donald Trump and JD Vance. But the laughter carried an unusual aftertaste, because almost instantly, murmurs of discontent began emerging, and not the quiet kind. So now people are left asking one straightforward question: what exactly did Fallon say that transformed a comedy routine into something that felt uncomfortably personal?
You know it is bad when a late-night joke does not just trend, it lingers. Jimmy Fallon delivered a segment that had everyone laughing at Donald Trump and JD Vance, but the laughter came with a strange aftertaste, because almost immediately, whispers of frustration started surfacing, and not the quiet kind. So now people are asking one simple question: what exactly did Fallon say that turned a comedy bit into something that felt a little too personal?
Terrible fate, my friends. We all know it. We all saw it. But think, it is not the worst fate. It is better to face a gunman than to live your life afraid to speak the truth.
He actually explained the whole situation using a bunch of his own popular internet memes. Like, take a look. He said, I admit that gas prices have inflated from this to this. Then added, I understand we all want to.
Everyone assumed it would be another harmless late-night segment, the kind where public figures get lightly mocked, the crowd laughs on cue, and the whole thing fades without a second glance. Instead, what played out on The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon felt less like a standard roast and more like a perfectly timed exposure, where the jokes did not simply land, they settled in. And for Donald Trump and JD Vance, that settling effect may have been the actual problem.
See this during a new interview, JD Vance admitted that he created the false claim about immigrants eating pets to create media attention. Yeah, Trump was like, everyone knows the first rule of fake news is not admitting to fake news.
At first, the setup appeared routine, almost suspiciously routine, which, in hindsight, is precisely what made it effective. Jimmy Fallon leaned into his signature charm, delivering his lines with that recognizable blend of dry wit and polished rhythm, giving every indication that nothing particularly explosive was on the way.
Then added, I understand we all want to go back to the olden days.
What set this moment apart, however, was not merely what he said but the manner in which he said it, because rather than reaching for exaggerated punchlines, he chose something far more understated, something that felt uncomfortably close to actual reality.
Every year I pick teams based on feelings and vibes, or as it's also known, the Trump-Iran war method. And there you go. I have a vibe.
That is where things began to change. The audience laughed, but not in the usual carefree way. There was a distinct edge to it, as though people were catching themselves mid-laugh, realizing the joke was not entirely fictional. Fallon skipped the broad impressions and over-the-top caricatures this time, and instead constructed a narrative that quietly drew both Trump and Vance into the same frame, highlighting comparisons, exposing contradictions, and letting the humor rise from implications rather than delivery. What made it hit even harder was the pacing. Rather than rushing from one punchline to the next, he let each idea breathe just long enough for the audience to connect the dots on their own. And once those connections started forming, the segment stopped feeling like entertainment and started feeling like analysis. That is where things get interesting, because the internet did exactly what the internet always does: it took a moment and stretched it far beyond its original boundaries. Clips began spreading almost immediately, and what people latched onto was not just the jokes themselves, but the attitude behind them.
War continues to drive up oil prices, but today Trump downplayed it, saying that he actually expected them to be worse. Although it wasn't a great sign that he said that from the back of an Uber pool. Meanwhile, Vice President JD Vance just admitted that gas prices will keep going up.
Some viewers described it as Fallon stepping outside his familiar territory, while others argued he had simply found a more calculated way to express what many had been thinking without ever saying it directly. Either way, the response was far from neutral. Trump supporters quickly labeled the segment as yet another case of late-night media bias, while critics countered that the jokes were tame compared to what has been said in other arenas. But the real tension came from something less obvious, the realization that Fallon, typically regarded as one of the more cautious hosts, had delivered something that felt unexpectedly pointed. And that raises a question people could not stop turning over. If someone known for playing it safe suddenly delivers something that feels genuinely sharp, does that make the moment more significant? Because that is precisely what appeared to happen here. Instead of the typical loud backlash or immediate counterattack, there was a peculiar pause, a kind of stillness that only made the situation more compelling. Reports and reactions began suggesting that Trump was not exactly pleased with the segment, with descriptions ranging from frustration to outright irritation, though, as usual, the precise details remained just out of reach, adding yet another layer of intrigue to the story. And then there is JD Vance, who found himself drawn into the narrative in a manner that felt both deliberate and calculated.
Hey, get this. President Trump just welcomed his 11th grandchild after his daughter Tiffany gave birth to a baby boy. Yeah. It's exciting. A new baby that's not Elon's. Isn't that great?
Fallon did not treat Vance as a background character or an afterthought. Instead, he positioned him as a central piece of a larger story, which in many ways amplified the impact of the humor. By locking the two together in a shared comedic structure, the segment built a dynamic where the audience was not simply laughing at individuals, but at the dynamic between them, the similarities, the contrasts, and the implications embedded in both. This approach shifted everything, because when humor moves from targeting a single person to examining a broader pattern, it becomes far harder to wave away. And that is precisely why the segment gained so much momentum. People were not just reacting to a joke, they were reacting to what the joke implied. And that implication carried considerably more weight than any individual punchline ever could. As the clips kept spreading, something else began unfolding. The conversation moved past Fallon himself and into a wider debate about the role of late-night comedy in shaping how the public sees things. Some argued that programs like his simply reflect the culture, while others insisted they actively shape it, and moments like this only make that boundary harder to locate. Because when a joke feels like commentary and commentary feels like a statement, audiences are left trying to figure out where one thing ends and another begins. And that uncertainty is precisely what keeps people tuned in.
Temporarily waive the Jones Act, which affects U.S. shipping. Now, if you don't understand the Jones Act, don't worry, because very few people have heard of the Jones Act. So we actually put together this educational video.
Hey, today we're going to learn about the Jones Act.
Meanwhile, the narrative surrounding Trump's reaction continued to develop, fueled by speculation, interpretation, and occasional hints from insiders and commentators who claimed some knowledge of what was unfolding behind the scenes. Whether or not those claims were fully accurate almost became irrelevant, because the perception of frustration alone was enough to keep the story breathing. One could even argue that the reaction itself became part of the spectacle. But here is the twist that makes this whole situation even more intriguing: the segment was not particularly aggressive by conventional standards. It did not lean on shocking language or outrageous accusations. Instead, it worked precisely because it felt controlled, measured, and intentional, which made it far more difficult to dismiss as just another throwaway joke. That restraint is what gave it its power. Because when something feels understated, people tend to lean in closer, searching for what they might have missed, and in doing so, they often end up engaging with it far more deeply than they would with something louder or more blunt. And that brings us back to the central question.
When prices weren't making us so sad and angry. But in the end, gas prices will lower and everyone will be popping champagne and saying, "Thank you, Mr. President." There you go. That's very.
Why did this particular moment stand out when so many similar moments have passed without leaving a mark? The answer may lie in timing, tone, and expectation, because Fallon was simply not expected to deliver something like this. And that element of surprise fundamentally changed how audiences received it. When someone associated with gentle humor suddenly introduces a sharper edge, it creates a contrast that is nearly impossible to overlook. It also raises the bar for what comes next, because viewers are no longer tuning in purely for light entertainment, they are watching to see whether that edge reappears, whether the subtle shift was a one-time occurrence or the start of something more consistent. The latter is far harder to address, because responding too forcefully risks making it look like the joke struck a nerve, while ignoring it allows the narrative to grow without resistance. It is a delicate balance, and one that plays out entirely in real time. As the story continues to circulate, the boundaries between comedy, commentary, and controversy stay blurred, creating a situation where every fresh reaction adds another piece to an already complicated picture.
Yep, Vance admitted that he made the whole thing up, but besides being overtly racist and making Trump look like a total fool at the debate, no harm done, right? It's not the first thing he's made up either. Vance also said gangs of criminals.
And in a media environment where attention is the most valuable currency, moments like this have a way of growing far beyond their original context. What began as a few minutes of late-night television has since become a talking point, a debate, and for many a defining illustration of how humor can intersect with politics in ways that are simultaneously entertaining and revealing. So the real question is not simply what Fallon said, but why it resonated the way it did, and what that tells us about the current moment, the audience, and the evolving role of comedy in a world where the line between laughter and reality keeps getting thinner. What makes this even more fascinating is how precisely the tone of that segment appeared calibrated, almost like a balancing act performed out in the open. Jimmy Fallon did not suddenly reinvent himself as a different kind of host overnight. Yet there was a perceptible shift in how the material was presented, as though the humor had been sharpened just enough to cut through the usual noise without coming across as confrontational. That quiet precision is what gave the moment its unusual weight, because it demanded more attention from viewers than they typically would have given it. And attention, once captured in that particular way, has a tendency to multiply.
News is still Iran. President Trump has been really focused on trying to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Listen to what he's been saying about it. First, Trump said, "It's time for our ships to embark on a very dangerous voyage." And Carnival Cruise said, "Hey, that's our slogan."
Clips continued circulating not merely because they were funny, but because they felt layered, as though each viewing uncovered something slightly new. Some viewers focused on the surface-level comedy, while others examined the construction of the jokes themselves, noting how the framing placed Donald Trump and JD Vance inside a shared story that neither could easily exit. It was not just about the words used, but about how the narrative was built around them. And that is where the reaction becomes almost predictable, because even silence begins to carry meaning. Meanwhile, The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon carried on as normal, which may have been the most strategic decision of all. There was no dramatic follow-up, no effort to amplify the segment or clarify its intent, just a quiet return to the familiar rhythm of sketches, interviews, and lighthearted bits. That normalcy created a contrast that made the original segment stand out even further, as though it existed slightly apart from the show's usual current. And that contrast raises yet another question that is difficult to set aside.
Yeah, the big story is still the ongoing war in Iran. Trump asked all the NATO countries to send ships to help him unblock the Strait of Hormuz, but he's not getting a lot of positive responses. Let's take a minute to do a roll call and see how each country replied to Trump.
Was this a one-off moment that happened to land perfectly, or was it a preview of something more intentional, a quiet evolution in how Fallon handles material that carries political weight? Because if it is the latter, the implications extend well beyond a single segment. For years, Fallon has cultivated a reputation for being accessible, agreeable, and largely non-combative, especially when measured against other late-night hosts who lean far more heavily into direct political commentary. That image is part of what made this moment so unexpected, because it introduced a level of sharpness that did not fully match the persona audiences had come to know. And when expectations are disrupted, people take notice. For JD Vance, the situation carries its own distinct complexity. Being brought into a narrative alongside Trump is nothing new, but the way it was handled here felt different. Less direct, but more interconnected, as though the humor was drawing a connecting line between them rather than simply mentioning them in the same sentence. That kind of framing is difficult to counter, because it operates through implication rather than accusation, leaving very little room for a clean rebuttal.
Are storming our towns wearing overalls. He even posted a picture.
Now they're eating our bananas.
And that is the quiet brilliance of it. Because when a joke is built on implication, any attempt to push back risks reinforcing the very connection it is trying to challenge. Ignoring it, on the other hand, allows the idea to take hold and spread without opposition. It becomes a no-win scenario not because of the intensity of the joke, but because of the way it is constructed. And those questions do not come with easy answers. Because the intersection of comedy and politics has always been complicated, but moments like this make that complexity impossible to sidestep. When humor begins to mirror reality closely enough that the difference becomes blurry, it forces audiences to sit with the possibility that what they are laughing at is not entirely made up.
The new head of NASA wants Trump to reclassify Pluto as a planet. Yeah, Pluto is commonly referred to as a small dwarf planet. Trump heard that. It's like, in that case, we're naming it.
Here is one example that surfaced. The new head of NASA reportedly wants Trump to reclassify Pluto as a planet. Pluto, of course, is widely recognized as a dwarf planet. The joke had Trump responding by saying they would simply rename it Planet. That moment captures exactly how the line between the comic and the real keeps shifting. So attention turns again, not just to what happened, but to what follows. Will Fallon lean further into this approach, refining it, revisiting it, building it into a defining style that weaves humor together with understated commentary? Or will this moment remain an anomaly, a perfectly aligned convergence of tone, timing, and subject matter that cannot be easily repeated? Because if this segment demonstrated anything, it is that impact does not always require volume. Sometimes the most subtle shift produces the loudest echo. And once that echo begins to travel, it becomes almost impossible to pull back.